And for the last part of this exercise, you are gonna sketch out first the volumetric representations. So what we're gonna need for this stage is 3 cubes and 2 circles. So I'm gonna go with 2 circles on top and 3 cubes down here. This would be spheres, not circles. So my light logic is going to be, the light source is going to come from slightly in the front from the right. So it's going to be like this, because it's simple. So that's the direction of my light source, as you can see with this little arrow here. Now that I've sketched out my 2 spheres and 3 cubes for this last part of the exercise, I am ready to go off of the triad tests, because I did not render all the triad tests in the video demo for you guys. I'm going to have to go with what I have here, and you can do the same, but just rely on your previous triad tests when you start rendering volume here. I'm gonna go with slightly watered down approach first, because we're looking at triad tests and not the first 3 monochromatic strips. The renditions here will include different hues within them. So for the primary scheme, what we're keeping in mind while rendering these forms are how dark or light those values were, and you can have your triad tests in front of you when you're on the step of this exercise. So I remember that my darker value was mixed by combining my green and my blue. So I'm going to try to mix some of that together. And because the light is coming, in my situation, is coming from here, I'm keeping in mind what planes and what surfaces will receive most light and which will not. So I'm gonna go with just a lighter. You gotta remember the light logic, so the core shadow is the darkest part, right? So I'm gonna try to, and I'll bring in my reflected light with tinted version of it. And I'm gonna put a darker pass over the core shadow section, which is where the light is having the hardest time reaching. Okay, so maybe I will kind of wash some of that pigment off the brush so it's not as opaque. Right now it looks pretty monochromatic. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to bring in even less pigment, rinsing off my brush again and going watered down here, almost like watercolor. And also what you can play with here is leaving, I'm gonna use my paper towel and take some of that out and leaving that highlight either sharp, like if it was a reflective surface, or you could go more of a matte surface and have that light middle tone section of the light logic on a sphere more gradual. But if you want to create an illusion of the surface being shiny, like made out of some kind of glass, marble, or whatever, then the highlight would be a sharp transition. And we can bring that highlight back in without having to dilute it with water by simply taking the white and just going, once it dries a little bit, going with the white and just bringing that highlight back in. But I'm gonna add, based on my rendering of the primary color scheme, I'm gonna add that purple that's not so tinted, that red and blue together. See if I can get some of that darker hue to really show more contrast for my on my core shadow here. Some of the mixture will occur, of course, on the paper too, so that it's not patchy, and the gradation between core shadow and light middle tone here is nice and smooth. And you can see the additive method is making the value appear much darker already with just adding that red to it. It's good to have a sheet of paper nearby in case you need to test it somewhere else before diving in. If you're uncertain about how that is going to play out, I would recommend having a sheet of paper on the side where you can do little quick tests. Kind of mix in some of that green over here. Still too much water, but that's okay. I'm actually gonna add some white now to this color that I have on my brush, and see if I can get it a little bit more opaque throughout here. To really create that 3D volume look. Highlight somewhere around here, and then maybe I can even do stuff like bring a little bit of reflected light with my tinted color that's already on my brush right down here. And I also want to add, so light is coming from this direction, this way. Now I want to add just to ground it a little bit. Got yet another cast shadow that is some of that pigment out, that is moving in that direction because of the light logic. Need a little bit of tinting here, a little bit of white, just to indicate that it's gradually phasing out. Maybe a little bit more white, and just kind of creating a little bit of a gradation here with the cast shadow. And I'm pretty happy with most of this rendition. The only other thing I might add is get my core shadow a little bit darker, again because I unfortunately put too much water. So it's a little bit of that push and pull kind of dance back and forth. And if your brush gets muddy, you know, it's nice to have another clean one handy, and you can just go with pure white for that highlight if you really wanted to. And you can also play with maybe textural quality. Maybe I'll go with more of a mark making type of highlight here, just to pretend like the surface is not entirely smooth. And also what white is good for is cleaning up edges. If your background is empty and you're doing like a spot illustration for a magazine or a newspaper or something like that, online edition, and cleaning up that edge by painting around it with value, you could just do quick blocking in like that, and that will fix things real quick. Now you're gonna add even more reflected light because this and this are now too close. Maybe I want to add even more reflected light here with a little bit of that turquoisey green that I have on my palette already mixed. Just go in with the very much on the edge, pretending there's quite enough ambient light for me to see that type of effect on my sphere. And I really want to get even darker down here, but I don't want to touch my black. I only want to work with the color scheme from my triad test. So I'm going to see if I can mix the 3 again with the red and blue and green, and see if I can even arrive at a darker value right underneath here where the light is having very much a hard time reaching. Now I've got to be careful not to mix in my white that's right next to it, and maybe we can even use some mark making here as well. I'm gonna rinse my palette real quick so I have a little bit of space to mix some new colors for, let's say, this cube. I'm not gonna do all of them for the demo because you don't want to sit here for 3 hours listening to me talk, right? So I want to do an analogous one, and let's pretend that one of my triad tests had an analogous that had a yellow, orange, yellow, and orange, red. I'm just gonna grab another palette. You can do the same or rinse the previous one, or you can even use a paper towel and wipe some of the pigments out of the palette that way. Okay, so here's my light yellow. Notice how much tint is in that yellow out of the tube. It is quite a lot out of the tube, which is very frustrating. So then I'm gonna do, because I'm trying to go with analogous and I don't have an orange in the set, I'm gonna pre-mix an orange myself with the red that I had. Let's see, this is this scarlet red, and there's this rose one, but not a fan of that rose one, so I'm gonna go with just primaries. And I'm gonna squeeze some red here. Mix from lighter value pigment to here so that I don't put red in here, because the red will contaminate this real quick, so I don't want to do that. And I want to create an analogous scheme of yellow, orange, yellow, and orange, red. So with that said, this will remain the same. So I just need a blob here, and I need also some here. Then I can add white to tint it to bring the light and the value back up. So I'm gonna do one, just a tiny little bit of red. So that would be my orange, yellow, orange. And then I'm gonna bring a little bit more red here. And the value is obviously gonna decrease quite quickly with that. I'm gonna try not to make a mess here, and light is coming from above in my case, so maybe this plane is gonna receive more light, this is gonna be somewhere in between, and this one is gonna be darkest. So I already have the darkest on my brush. Okay, with analogous, see, we don't really have a huge value range here, but we can add white in order to bump it up. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna still use the same value that I already pre-mixed, and I'm gonna kind of indicate maybe some of the cast shadow, so it's coming out of these corners down. Light is from the front, right, so it's going in kind of the same direction as the sphere above. So I'm just using little projecting sort of lines to create an illusion of that cast shadow on the right. Because it's opaque, again, I'm just going to add white to differentiate, to push the three-dimensional quality of this rendering and tint my pre-mixed values that way. Okay, so too close, can't see where one ends and another one begins. Because I already have some lighter value here, I'm just gonna give it 2 seconds to really finish drying. In the meantime, rinsing off some of the darker value off the brush, keeping some water on it, and oops, spray the sheet of paper with it. I'm gonna use this yellow, perhaps, and just see how we can go with that as an open hue. Again, opaque medium, I can undo, fix anything I want. I can go with another tinted hue over it and mute it down. No need to stress about getting it right or anything like that. Okay, and then this one is gonna be facing slightly away from the light, so I'm going to use my pre-mixed yellow orange and lock that in here. Kind of constantly thinking in terms of light logic and how I'd like this to be received. Maybe I want just a tiny bit darker on the bottom, just gonna take a tiny bit of the other red orange to darken the value and go slightly darker towards the bottom here, just so that I can give it even more of that depth illusion. And then since I already have a lighter value color on my brush, I'm also going to do the same for the back of the cast shadow, because cast shadows tend to be only darkest right next to the object they casted by, and then they gradate away from that edge, that transition edge. And if there's too much pigment, you can use your paper towel and get some of that pigment out of the brush, some of that paint, and just kind of also use a textural application if you want to gradually move that paint away. So not everything needs to be super opaque. And I need now my tinted colors as well. So let's add a little white, just a tiny bit. Oh, actually I already have white squeezed on the previous palette, so I'm gonna use that. And I'm gonna add a little bit of white here to, let's say, the top of this edge. It will mute it also, and it will bump up my value slightly. Maybe I'll add a little bit on the back here. I want maybe just a little bit here. Now I don't want to introduce yellow too much, yellow orange to the back edge of this cube, because it will give it a perception that it will be part of these planes, and I want it to keep remaining in that red hue to keep it separate. So I'm going to take a little bit of the red orange hue that I've premixed here and take a little bit of white on my brush and see what kind of tinted hue I'll end up with, just to bump up this edge slightly. Let's say there's a lot of ambient light and we're kind of getting some of that reflection back. Maybe just a little bit here, keeping it nice and painterly. So that it communicates volume, but I don't want to overdo it. I still want to maintain the value dark on the side and stay within my analogous color scheme. Something like that, kind of like it. And now I'm just going to add just a little more white to the top plane, bump that up, a little white, take that yellow, and so it's not so saturated and screaming at us. Maybe give that part of the top plane more appearance of light, but I still have some other yellow, more darker value yellow, saturated yellow showing towards the left as light travels away from it. This would be like if it's a pretty close light source. It's pretty cool. I kind of like it. I'll leave it at that. All right, and I'll show one more demo of the last triad test that you have under this assignment, which I mistakenly told you either or. So we were talking about it as in only warm scheme or only cool scheme. In fact, it was not correct. You want to choose both two colors of either warm and one cool, or vice versa, two colors that are cool and one warm on that last triad test. And I will make sure that you guys get updated via email on that as well. So what I'm gonna do here with my other cube, for that I will go with what I already have here, and I'll go with two warms and one cool as my triad test that we don't have in the video demo, but I think it will be fine. And I'm gonna do that green again as a cool color. And you'll notice, because one thing that occurs with primaries being used in the same image is that they start to really vibrate off of each other. So let's see, I'm gonna use this cube as my little dummy, and mixing my green now as if I would in a triad test with that orange red. It should produce pretty dark hue. Maybe a little more red here, and again, that green out of my tube is pretty tinted, so it's turning into this mud. All right, for that mud, I'm gonna kind of lock in just the cast shadow right there on the edge. I'm gonna add a little bit of white as I am moving away from the darkest part of it, and to indicate where the cast shadow is. And I didn't mix my color thoroughly enough, so it's starting to leave little streaks of color from the bristles of my brush. Okay, that's kind of cool. I'm gonna keep the shaded side of the cube that's facing away from the light source as cool. So I'm gonna go with more green here. And then the sides that are facing the light, I'm gonna keep them maybe warm and see what happens. Adding a little bit more water here just so that I don't go crazy on the opacity right away, but I also don't want it to mess up my paper like I did with the first sphere and got this sort of little, I don't know what you call them, parts of the paper that are rubbing off. Now block that side in. Okay. Without rinsing my brush, I'm gonna go with a little bit more opacity towards the bottom just to get it a little darker, even though that green is very, very limited, but I will give it a shot, see what I can do. And bump that, well, actually push that down, not bump it up, and just a tiny little bit of white now with a little water and mixing it with that green for the top portion of the plane. And also it's doing two jobs at once. It's lowering my opacity and bringing the value slightly up. Right there on the edge. That's good. And now I'm gonna switch to my warm colors after I rinse all this green off my brush. Green and white, because it will contaminate my premix colors right here very, very fast. So I'm just going to, let's say, go with the lighter one first so I can then use a darker color for this side. So let's go with this one. And I'm actually gonna tint it right away, right here on the side, with a little bit of white. And actually we can mix, because on the triad you would be mixing green, orange, yellow, orange, and orange red. So on that triad we would be mixing that green and that orange red together, and that green with yellow. So I'm gonna add a little bit of green to this yellow to keep it within this color scheme, but just ever so slightly, and see if I can cool this down just a bit, but it still will be a rather warm, sort of warm yellow. And look at that. We want a little bit more yellow, orange, a little warmer on this side. I still had a little bit of green left on that, and I'm gonna just get some of that reddish orange, and it will push the value down just a notch. It's a little bit muddied now, but still warm cool as the prompt suggests. So it's a little bit more warm on this side. Creates a pretty cool, interesting effect where maybe like at a sunset you would see things like that occur, where some areas are still rather warm and the opposite sides that aren't receiving light, they will start appearing much cooler. I'm gonna just bring just a tiny bit of red into this side, push the value down so it's not open green. Just a little bit of red kind of neutralizes it. Tiny of that red orange I had pre-mixed to keep it within that same color scheme of warm cool both, and mute some of the turquoisey green just a little bit. I think I like that. And I'm just gonna add a little bit more yellow here. Not too much water on the brush, so it's diluting my opacity, which we don't want. And maybe just a little bit of that tinted, with a little bit of white tinted orangey yellow, more, a little bit more white, a little bit more yellow, and just a hint of red. Push that value up. And as always, just like we talked about in the value sections of the course, we want to make sure that it's the transition edge between different values that is showing most contrast, as opposed to kind of a smooth. So now I'm mixing that green and red to push the value down again, so that I can maybe get this very edge much darker. Too much water, so it's bleeding into my top. But the transition edge is where you want the value to be, or the contrast to be most pronounced. So, and maybe I'll even add whatever's on my brush, but just very carefully. Don't want to overpower that purple. Maybe I'll introduce just a little bit of that turquoisey green that's already with tint on my brush, just to indicate some gradation of that shadow. And also it will, colors, they tend to, objects that are next to each other tend to absorb colors, so that's what that will do. It will create that effect of like one color is absorbed by another. Right. Using really tinted yellowish red now, to adding more water because it's super thick, because my paint is drying out now. I'm gonna bring maybe just a little bit more of that light transition right here, and then pull away from the transition edge down to create even more contrast by tinting my paint and suggesting like it's a strong source of light. That's the kind of effect that I'm creating here. Maybe I'll do the same push here with that previous green, yellowish green mixture I had, but now I'm going to tint that quite a bit as well. And my brush is pretty opaque now, so I'm going right over that puddle with more opacity, more pigment, load it on the brush, and I am able to now offset a little bit of that mess that I've created earlier by just controlling my opacity slightly more so it's not runny. Like so. I can even go get a little bit of that edge highlighted, just a notch, just to kind of indicate a little reflected light, so the value on the transition edge isn't the same. So for, let's say for this one, I'm gonna go with secondary color scheme. And unfortunately, I don't have a purple or violet mixed in my actual gouache set, so I'm going to try my best to kind of pre-mix it real quick with this deep rose that I have and a little bit of blue, and see if I can arrive at close enough of a violet that way. Just testing it real quick. And secondary color scheme is obviously green, orange, and violet. So let's go mix these guys, two of these guys together. See if I can get, yeah, that will work. That's actually nicer than this one, much more saturated. And then we would need my orange, and I pretty much already had that with yellow and red. I'm gonna use this guy, even though there's a little bit of green in there, but it's too little to really affect it. So here's my orange. I might need a little bit more yellow in there. Okay, that's gonna be my yellow-ish orange pre-mixed. And then the other one we need is green. That's more like kind of yellowy green. So I'm not gonna rinse my brush right now and pre-mix it. I will pre-mix it in a second. So let's see. So let's do the sphere.